Get that there. Great. Okay, good morning, everyone. Once again, a real privilege to be involved in the dairy school, and wonderful to see so much nutrition being discussed amongst the vet students. I think it's absolutely critical that the vets and the industry actually start talking to each other much more and work together, find ways to work together, because we're all specialists in our own right, and we can learn a heck of a lot from each other. So yeah, my topic today is lameness and minerals, and it's going to be a sort of a talk of two parts, really. First, I'll talk about lameness and maybe some of the more lesser known facts around lameness. I deal specifically with dairy, but the same principles apply to beef and sheep and goats. And then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of minerals and exactly how we manage this stuff and how we do what we do. So starting off and looking at lameness, we need to advance to the next slide. There we go. Gotcha. Okay, so lameness is categorized and defined by 5 different locomotion scoring: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we do this by looking at the backs of the animals. So when they're standing and when they're walking, if they stand with a straight back and walk with a straight back, that's absolutely normal. This table over in the center here, this is the amount of milk that is lost for each advancing challenge. So if they're standing but they're walking with a slight curve in their back, they lose a little bit of milk. Obviously, if they're standing with a curve in their back and they're walking, this means they're trying to get the pressure off their back feet. And this is actually a lame animal, but this cow is not limping. And if we look at our pasture systems, where most of our cows in the country are on pasture systems, this cow will be losing 8% of her milk. By the time she's limping, and we can tell which foot is actually a problem. You can see this cow is lifting her one foot off the ground. By the time she's limping, she's losing 11%. And by the time she's extremely sore and doesn't want to put any weight on it, this cow is losing 34% of her milk. And most of the time, people only look for limping cows. And we need to understand that these cows are lame, the score 3s, and the 4 and 5s are pretty much 3-legged cows. They have one broken foot that, quite frankly, is not going to work very well. And we need to identify and record and treat all of the cows that are standing and walking with an arched back. And here's why. We need to first understand, excuse me a moment, I just had a bunch of people walking out. Hang on a second. There we go. Now we're back together. Sorry about that. We first need to understand this quote by Mike Hutchins: never use an additive when the same effect can be affected by a management change on farm. We need to not just understand that, oh, we want selenium. And if I explain this diagram here, all of our input, our effort, our money goes in one end of the pipe, and our output, which is actually our bank balance, comes out the other end of the pipe. And a pipe is dented. So the bigger the dents, obviously, the more flow is restricted. And if we are talking about mineral nutrition and we focus entirely on selenium, we may miss the really obvious factors of calf rearing, lameness, and milk fever, which could be far more pertinent and far more important to deal with from a management point of view than simply throwing some additional selenium into the process. So if we look at how common lameness actually is on a farm, there's a quote in Mark that says, "Do you have eyes but fail to see?" And between myself and my colleague, we have personally scored 46,900 cows across 62 farms. And if we look at our milk loss scores on pasture, there's our score 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 with the commensurate percentage milk loss. This is the average occurrence of the number of cows falling into each of these score brackets. So in score 3, we had almost 16% of the cows were score 3 and 4 and 5. With each percentage milk loss, there is a price per litre, and the average loss across nearly 50,000 animals was 477,000 Rand a year to lameness. Now, if we actually look at the cumulative percentages, this is what a farmer will see. They look at the lame cows, they look at the limping cows, and they see 3.4%. Ah, it's less than 5, it's kind of okay. But what they don't see is the 19.3% of cows that are actually lame on their farm. And this is what I call the 5X rule. For every tripod, there are 5 other lame cows. And this is actually backed up by 2 peer-reviewed papers. One showed that farmers only see 10% of the lameness on their farms, and the other showed that farmers only see 23% of the lameness. And these figures work out to about 15%. So that is pretty much accurate with the science that's out there. So why do we care? Why do we care about lameness? I mean, obviously 470,000 Rand is important, but what actually happens, and it's what I call the lameness cascade. So a cow that is 3+ is going to walk less and it's going to walk slowly. By walking less, your cow is going to take longer to get to her food source. She's going to take longer to get to and from the dairy. And that's going to very much affect her feed intake. She's going to reduce her dry matter intake and she's going to slug feed. When she slug feeds, I've seen this personally on a TMR diet that I designed. The cows that were lame were slug feeding, and they actually gave themselves ruminal acidosis just because of the volume of food that they ate in one sudden point, because the cows that didn't have lameness were feeding normally, lots of small meals through the day, and they were fine. But the lame cows actually gave themselves acidosis and they actually became more lame. If we have a low dry matter intake, obviously our body condition will drop. That affects our milk, our persistency, it's our fertility. If our fertility goes out on pasture, obviously we need them to try and get a spring cow needs to be a spring cow next year and a spring cow the following year. But if we have low fertility, then a cow that calves in September might skip a month. Next year she calves in October. Then it's getting a bit warm, so then she skips 2 months. Now you've got a Christmas cow that should have calved back in September during the spring flush. So this actually starts messing around with our economics on pastures quite a lot. And obviously, if we're walking very slowly, we just stand more. Cows don't make milk while they're standing. They need to lie down to make milk efficiently. And it messes with your time budget and the bad gets worse. So there are a lot of implications around lameness. Just to highlight just one of them, this is a disease impact on reproduction. And you can see that our normal sort of 82 days to from calving to pregnancy, confirmed in calf, and lameness will push that out to about 120 days. So this is how we can miss a month every single time we try and inseminate our animals. Excuse me. So let's drill into the types of lameness that we've got. Not all lameness is the same. We've got infectious lesions such as digital dermatitis, foot rot, heel erosion, interdigital dermatitis. For these things, we need to treat the causative agent of them. These are caused by bacteria or by some sort of external agent that is growing inside the hoof. And we do this with the use of foot baths, well-designed foot baths, because a poorly designed foot bath is absolutely hopeless. It gives you lulls you into a false sense of security. You think that you've got everything under control because you're foot bathing your cows, but meanwhile you actually don't. By the way, many of the pictures that I'm showing, like these hygiene scores, the foot bath, etc., we actually have available as handouts and posters. So if you would like them, please take my email, contact me, and I will gladly send them to you. They are free of charge. So yeah, please reach out. The foot bath one particularly is very, very useful in that it helps you design a foot bath that's actually going to work for your cows, rather than a foot bath for the sake of having a foot bath. And with our infectious lesion control, we also need to understand how dirty our cows actually are. Obviously, getting medication onto the back of this foot to treat a hairy heel wart will be a heck of a lot easier than drilling through all of the mud and filth and manure on the bottom of this foot. So obviously that determines how we use our foot bath and the frequency of these things. So non-infectious lesions, these are lesions that are caused by mechanical or non-infectious sources. It's kind of in the name, isn't it? So we've got our white line lesions are the most common, sole ulcers, where you actually get an ulceration in the sole. A lot of the pastures, the cows simply walk through their feet and the pedal bone comes through the bottom of the toe. Corkscrew claw, this is actually a genetic thing. Vertical fissures, hardship grooves, these are from a dramatic change in diet. These can be caused, these are also called sand cracks. So there's a lot going on with non-infectious lesions. And what we need to understand is that if you get a nail through your foot, a foot bath is not going to fix it. We need to understand what lesions are actually happening on our farm. So what I would do, what we do at Chemunique, is we go out to a farm and we actually do a locomotion scoring, and we tell the farmer, compared to the targets for your farm, this is where you're currently standing. We stick a peg in the ground and we say, you are $1 million behind. The worst farm we've ever been to was 9 million rand lost to lameness every year. And they implemented a whole bunch of the things that we recommended, and they managed to seriously change their situation over a couple of years and save an enormous amount of money. So first we measure how bad the situation is. We then analyze and interpret exactly what's going on with the lesions, because if you have lesions, mechanical lesions that are hurting your cows, such as some random 90-degree turn as they're coming out the dairy, that's causing them to pivot on that foot and damage the foot, running them through a foot bath is simply not going to help until you remove that causative agent. If your roads and your walkways are absolutely shot, running them through a foot bath or putting down a mat or something like that for them to walk over is really not going to make that big a difference until you fix the roads. So we need to investigate, we need to plan, execute, and review. And this is very much what we do. So looking at what's causing lameness on the farms, I absolutely love asking farmers this one question. So what's causing lameness? And this is pretty much the standard response that I get. Little sharp stones, they're getting in my cow's feet. There's nothing I can do, it's just the quarry I've got. But what people need to remember, and what all of us need to remember, is that the hoof is a castle that falls from within. Where you've got a beef animal that is in the middle of winter, walking over some very, very quartzy, hard ground, those cows are not going to have a problem with their feet at all. The lameness is not a function of the geology of the area. Lameness is the function of the quality of the hoof. So you stand a cow in water for 6 weeks, like most pasture cows during summer in rainfall areas, or winter cows in the Cape, they are going to go lame because the quality of the hoof degrades. So let's look at what's actually happening within our hooves to give you an idea. We must remember that a cow stands in her feet, not on her feet. And what do I mean by this? The cow has got the bone coming from the skeleton, comes down to the pedal bone. This pedal bone is suspended from the wall, from the horn capsule, by the suspensory lamellae. This is a structure that is not bone, it's not keratin, it is a suspensory structure that's like made out of ligaments, I think. And this pedal bone needs to hang inside the foot capsule. Now, because it's not rigidly fixed to the horn capsule, it can actually move slightly independently of the horn capsule. So let's look at some white line ulcers. This is a hoof trimmer's diagram of a foot. The claw is divided to an outside and an inside claw and different zones. If we're looking at sole ulcers, are usually in zone 4, and white lines are 1, 2, and 3 around the white line end here. 80% of our lesions are going to happen in zone 3 and 4, So 2/3 of the way back on the outside foot, on the back feet, on the outside claw of the back feet. 83%, 83, 84% of our lesions are going to happen there. And why is that? Why is that happening? So here's our picture of the foot. This pedal bone needs to be nice and parallel with the ground to distribute the weight across the whole surface of the pedal bone. The outside horn capsule has got two areas of growth. One is the base plate here. This is the sole corium, and the other is the wall corium, which comes from the hair at the top. This one is exactly the same. If you take a second to look at your thumbnail, you have a little white semi-crescent at the front of your thumbnail. That's the corium. And if you want to know whether it's sensitive or not, try biting down as hard as you can on the very tip of your thumbnail. And your thumb will soon tell you that the corium is quite a sensitive area. And so when we are growing a foot, it grows out this way and it grows down this way. But the type of horn that is deposited is much harder on the toe and softer on the heel. So if we look at what actually happens if we walk on feet that are becoming overgrown, the soft horn on the back wears away and we get this pointy toe thing going on here. Now, we're going to put a 550, 600, 700, 800 kilo animal is not going to walk on the tippy toes of the point of her feet. It's going to depress that foot flat on the ground. Walking on very springy pastures does the same thing. It pushes the toe up because there's a huge kikuyu mat that keeps the toes up. And essentially what it does is it rotates this pedal bone and it starts loading the back of the foot. Can you see why 80% of our lesions happen on the back of the foot? And this causes small microhemorrhages between the bone in the suspensory lamellae. And when you get blood in the keratin, it reduces the strength of the keratin and allows access to the bones. So as vets, what does this actually look like? These are the pedal bones out of a heifer, and they are not that big. I mean, that's my hand. Hey, they're sitting in the palm of my hand. They're really not that big. By second lactation, look at what's happening to the underside of the pedal bone. This is a second lactation animal, and we worried about stones coming in from the outside. Well, what about the stones she's depositing on the inside? This is the bone reacting to trauma as the cow walks. So the osteoblasts in the bone, they sense the trauma and they start depositing calcium in that area. Now, what do you think this is like if it was mashing down on the corium the entire time? Or how about this fourth lactation disaster? I mean, this is absolutely catastrophic. And it's no wonder this cow was culled for being lame. This cow would have been extremely lame and extremely uncomfortable and very unpleasant. So you can actually see this happening if you are ever in the field and trimming animals. This is actually a beef cow's foot that I took a photo of, but you can actually see the white line coming around here. It's actually nice and healthy. This is the sole and this is the wall, and the junction between the two is called the white line. I was trimming with one of the hoof trimmers on a dairy, and the slivers he was taking off with his hoof knife, I picked one up and you can actually see the blood in the white line. You can actually see the blood from the trauma in the white line. And essentially what this has done, it's taken a very hard cheese that's incredibly difficult to cut, and it's turned it into a soft cheese full of holes, and those holes are full of blood. And there's nothing that bacteria love more than a little dark cave full of food to proliferate. So while this is a mechanical problem caused by trauma within the hoof, it can become infected. It doesn't make it an infectious lesion because one cow cannot give another cow white line lesions because it's non-infectious. But it can be infected and the animal needs treating with antibiotics and medical therapies. So if we look at our score 3 cows, here are a couple of pictures I took of cows in a race. If you look at the rails that's what the flat back of a cow is supposed to look like. You can see the arch in this animal's back. And then I saw one that I thought, no, I wonder, is this just a genetic thing or what's going on? This little tiny lump here. And so those are the two cows that we're going to examine. If we lift their feet, you can see that this cow who was not limping, she was not identified as a lame cow. Look at the size of this white line lesion. We had to model away pretty much the whole side of her hoof and put a block on this side just to cut back and get all of this gunk out of her foot. If we look at this cow, she was largely okay, but check how much blood she's got in the white line. That sliver of hoof that I showed you was from this cow, was from this black cow. And you can see that she's got two white line lesions starting. If these start running and joining, in a couple of weeks, she's going to look like this. So it's really important to identify our score 3 cows and do something about it. Looking at this white cow, do you notice anything about her feet? Specifically, how much bigger the outside claw is to the inside claw. And this is something that is very important to understand on commercial dairies, is the concept of balance, where we're keeping our cows for year and year and year and year on. As they grow, the outside claw actually gets bigger than the inside claw. And you can see if we hold the hoof knife level, there's like a centimeter difference between the two. So this claw is hardly ever even touching the ground now, and this claw is taking all of the weight. And you wonder why she's got such trauma and an open white line lesion on her foot. So what's actually happening with why does this happen? How does it happen? It's all got to do with the interaction with concrete. Grooves, so this would be just a representation of concrete. And the grooves run in the direction of travel. We need them to run in the direction of travel because of this interaction right here. The outside claw catches on the sharp edges of the grooves. That's why we need lots of these little sharp edges all over the place on our concrete. But they need to run in the direction of travel, because when the cow actually is in motion, her foot doesn't go up and down. It makes a circular motion like that. It goes around, out, and in. The outer claw actually slides on the ground. Sorry, the inner claw slides and the outer claw catches on that edge. So what we've got is a situation where the inner claw is sliding and essentially being sandpapered away, wearing away slightly, and the outer claw is the one sorry, that's taking all of the compression and the pressure and the jarring insult. And the bone responds by depositing more calcium on the pedal bone, and the outer claw responds by depositing more keratin on the outer claw. So that's how we get an imbalance in a cow that is otherwise fairly healthy. And this is fixed by preventatively trimming your dry cows. By trimming dry cows during the at the end of their lactation, we can actually set them up for the transition and for the first kind of 2 months in lactation to be much more resistant to lameness by balancing these claws out, getting the weight distributed over the inner and outer claw, and enabling them to walk that much better. So that's pretty much it for the mineral, for the lameness side of things. Let's start moving over towards minerals. But the first thing we need to do is we need to look at some stresses. A cow that is unstressed has very few problems. A cow that is stressed creates lots of problems and costs lots of money. So if we look at summer stresses and transition stresses, let me give you a couple of facts that might blow your brain, because they blew my mind when I heard them first. A cow is a ruminant, and a ruminant exists by fermentation. Fermentation produces heat, and a cow produces as much heat as 160-watt light bulbs. If you were to take 160-watt light bulbs and hang them in an area that is taken up by a cow, which is not that much. A cow is very deep side on, but they're actually quite thin if you look at them from the top. 160-watt light bulbs is a lot of heat. Add to that summer, and you've got some serious heat stress coming. And transition, a fact that I just read the other day, a cow is 100 times more likely to get sick within a month of calving than at any other time during her lactation. Transition is a hugely stressful time for cows. It is not the start of her lactation. It is the end of her dry period, and the dry period is where we set these animals up for success so that they are not 100 times more likely to get sick during that first month. So what happens during stress? Lance Baumgard did some really, really nice work at Iowa State, and let's run through. Let's just drill right down very quickly. So here we've got the gut. The gut is folded in the small intestine. These folds have a blood supply inside them, and they're made up of epidermal enterocytes. These enterocytes are held together. You can't see it very well here, but they're held together by something, and they're held together by tight junctions. And tight junctions are protein complexes, usually claudin and occludin, that upholster the cells together. These are not individual cells. I mean, they are individual cells. They're not one continuous biological unit. These cells have to be held together, and they are only held together by the very top. You see, the bottom of the cells is not joined together. It's just the top. And we actually have a paracellular space, which is actually a gap between the cells, between the tight junctions as well. Now, this allows things like calcium and potassium and some minerals, etc., to get between the cells. It also allows our mast cells to stick their little sensory apparatus up here and sample the rumen contents and tell the immune system what's going on. And if we look at these tight junctions, this is what's holding the gut content away from the blood. And these proteins are made up of amino acids, which are then folded into a protein. Now, the folding of proteins is, it goes through 3 stages. So firstly, a link of amino acids, just a chain of amino acids, is a very stable state. Whilst it's being folded, it's very unstable. It's very easy for the shape of this protein to change. It's very easy for the tightness of the binding between 2 proteins to relax and reduce. Once it's fully folded, it goes back to a very stable state. The binding of the tight junctions has claudin coming from one side, occludin coming from the other side. They roll around each other and they grab each other like Velcro. But under times of stress, that folding structure, the stable state, is actually interrupted, and they go towards an unstable state. And those cells start moving apart. Let's have a look at what that looks like. You get to enjoy some more of my excellent cartoons. So here we've got two enterocytes. Inside the gut, we have that brown stuff called manure, and the green side is it's not green blood. It's good. It's locked away. The tight junctions have got this gap closed, and the cow is healthy and happy. Under forms of stress, these tight junctions, the folding of these structures is damaged, and the gut contents start making their way into the blood system. And this elicits an enormous response called inflammation. And inflammation is simply the body's immune system going to work, going to war with these new things that have arrived where they shouldn't. Things like bacteria, lipopolysaccharide, feed particles, all sorts of things like that in the blood. It's not where you want them. And inflammation and the immune system run on one thing pretty much and one thing only, and that's glucose. And Lance Baumgart did some wonderful work where he actually showed that a lipopolysaccharide insult, which is a very inflammatory molecule that you can inject into a cow, elicited a requirement of 1 kilogram of metabolic glucose every 12 hours. And this was a simulation of heat stress. Well, he did it with LPS, but he also did it with heat stress, where he just heated the cows in metabolic chambers, and he heated them to the terribly high temperature of 27 degrees. I mean, this is not hot, eh? Compared to some of our dairies. This is really not a critical heat stress. And 1 kilogram of glucose was used every 12 hours. How does this relate to feet? Our keratinocytes are obligate glucose users. So keratinocytes, which are the cells that differentiate into keratin and make horn, are more sensitive to a lack of glucose than they are to a lack of oxygen. So the use of the immune system in the gut of glucose to run any form of stress will immediately affect the quality of keratinocytes and therefore the lameness and the feet of our animals. So getting into the nitty-gritty of the minerals. We've got macro minerals and trace elements, trace minerals, macro elements, whatever you want to call them. The macro minerals, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sodium, these are like the steering wheel on your car. You can have a car and it can run and it can do all sorts of things that a car needs to do, but without a steering wheel, you are going to crash. And if we mess up our calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, you will see a crash in the cows. A cow that is only 5 grams short of calcium, only 5 grams in an entire cow, will die of milk fever. A cow that is low in phosphorus will, man, everything goes wrong when phosphorus is low. And interestingly enough, you can't actually knock a cow off her feet with a lack of phosphorus. So they get incredibly sick, but they don't ever actually fall down because it doesn't take the phosphorus out of the ATP in their muscles, but it does take it out of everywhere else and it affects them terribly. A cow with a lack of magnesium gets grass tetany, gets staggers. And these are very, very obvious mineral deficiencies that we deal with macro minerals. I'm not going to go into them very much because as far as our entire industry, the ratios, the amounts, the management of macro minerals is very successfully taken care of by nutritionists at large in the industry. But trace elements are a different thing. Trace elements you don't see. They're not the steering wheel that you hold on to. They're like the oil in your engine. Can you drive a car with a little bit of oil in the engine? Well, yes, you can. Is it better to have more oil in the engine? Yes, absolutely. Can you drive a car with no oil in the engine? Well, you can, actually. It sounds dreadful, but you will get a few Ks down the road before the whole thing seizes. So it's like the oil in the engine. People don't notice it, and unless you use the dipstick and check every now and again, you have no idea what is going on with your trace elements. Zinc, manganese, copper, selenium are the most famous. Chromium is very much coming. It's the new wonderkind of minerals. Cobalt and iron are also both very critical. So let's get into it. If we're at any doubt about whether trace elements are important, here are all the ways in which trace elements are involved in a cow. And the ones in red boxes, fertility, milk production, skin and hoof integrity, and disease resistance, those are the things that we choose to kill cows because of. Those are the main reasons that cows get culled from our herds, is for fertility, milk production, disease resistance, and skin and hoof integrity. So if you want to reduce your culling rates, look no further than trace elements. These things are really important. So now, instead of launching into an enormously boring hour-long talk on the mechanics of every single mineral that we've got, I'm just going to touch on some of the high points, and I'm going to start with my absolute favorite, which is zinc. When in doubt, put zinc. Just remember that if you take nothing away from this trip, from this talk, when in doubt, add zinc. Okay, I need this to go away, and I need to be able to click on this. This is a TED Talk by Tom O'Halloran. Just Google Zinc Sparks TED Talk, and you can listen to the whole thing. What Tom did, he is working on fertility for IVF treatments for people. Because what tends to happen is they will hyperovulate the woman. They will then take all of the eggs that she's produced, put them in a test tube, get sperm from the male, fertilize them, and then put them back in the female. And then she doesn't have one child like she wanted, she has quadruplets. And that's fairly life-changing experience for a young family, or like Octomom, who had 8 kids. It's kind of important to know which eggs have been fertilized and which ones haven't. So that's what Tom's actually working on here. And what he's done is he's tagged zinc pink. So you can see at 2 o'clock here, there's a little pink spot on the outside of the egg. That's actually the sperm. That's the spermatozoa that's gotten under the membrane of the egg. And what he showed, he's tagged the zinc pink with a fluorescent type of tag, a molecular tag. And what it shows is at the moment of fertilization, the moment those 2 chromosomes come together and fertilize that egg and life occurs, the cell draws in an enormous amount of zinc from the outside, over 60 times of its normal sort of resting zinc content. And then the moment afterwards, it kicks it all out because zinc is extremely reactive. And so just watch this for a second and you'll see, here comes the zinc, it's coming in, life happens, and it's going out. That's cool, though. That's really cool. So he can actually measure this using the intensity of the flash that it gives off. He can actually see this. So here's 9 eggs, and they've all been fertilized. They've all done their thing. And by the intensity of the flash, you can see that, oh, no, it's not a pen. This is a laser pointer. This one is a blastocyst. This one's a blastocyst. These 2 didn't do anything. And those ones did something, but they're not really mature enough. And so if we're going to help a family fall pregnant, we pick one of these 2 and we reimplant the egg, and then she has 1 child. This is really cool science, and it really calls into stark relief the importance of adding zinc to our diets if we want our animals to get pregnant. Zinc is not only there for sexy science and zinc sparks, it's part of 300 enzyme systems, biological systems, almost all of them use zinc. It's a key part of our inflammatory response, epithelial integrity, as we saw, our tight junctions are entirely zinc dependent. Hoof hardness is determined by the amount of zinc in the keratin. Hoof toughness is determined by biotin, so we need biotin and zinc together. And then sperm and egg quality. Almost every parameter of sperm quality that we measure, motility, directional motility, etc., almost all of them can be affected by the application of zinc. So when in doubt, add zinc. Our next element we'll look at is manganese. Everything is pink because manganese is all about fertility. This is the pink mineral. If you have fertility problems, add manganese. Manganese is really critical to everything, and here's why. Here is a very lonely looking follicle with a corpus luteum on the top of it. And everyone goes mad about selenium when we talk about fertility, and selenium is really important. But did you know that there's 11 times more manganese in the corpus luteum than there is selenium? And so if we are adding a lot of selenium to our diets and using Deficel and using all sorts of injectables and these sorts of things, we really need to understand that manganese is far more important if we're looking at the overall picture of fertility. Manganese is critical for reproduction because of its role in hormones. A lot of hormones are based around manganese. The production of them relies on manganese. And manganese is also really important in calcium metabolism. And because of the calcium metabolism angle, it's critical for joints, tendons, and bone density. So it's a really important mineral that we need to work with. Copper is defined by this picture. This is the straw that broke the camel's back. Copper is one of these creepy things that creeps up on you. Copper is taken up through the hepatic portal vein. Copper goes to the liver, and there copper sets up its home and lives. And copper will accumulate in the liver, and it will accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. 1 milligram per day, all the time. For the entire growth phase of a heifer for 2 years, if we feed her too much copper, she will accumulate all of that copper in her liver. When she comes down to calving, calving is the most stressful time of an animal's life, the stress that is put on that cow, the liver then decides, actually, I've got way too much copper, I need to get this out, and it dumps all of the copper out of the liver into her blood system. The copper binds preferentially to hemoglobin instead of oxygen, and you get a copper strike, where the cows metabolically asphyxiate because of copper. Copper is not an acute problem, it's a chronic problem, and we have to be sure that we are not overfeeding copper. Copper is a difficult dance because it's really important in enzymes and immune function, so we do need some copper. But background levels can be really high, and when we measure liver copper, we often see that liver selenium goes up because copper is a pro-oxidant and it damages the liver. The liver therefore recruits a whole bunch of selenium to work as an antioxidant to the copper, and so we can measure farms, and I've seen it on a couple of my clients, where we measure farms and the liver selenium is really high, and they go, oh, fantastic, we've got great liver selenium levels, you know, we can tap back on our selenium supplementation. But when you look at the liver copper, you can actually, it tells a different story. The selenium's there fixing the problems that copper are causing. It's not there being free to move around the body, etc. So these things really do need to be understood. A pop quiz for all you clever vets. Cobalt is critical in the formation of this molecule. What does this molecule mean? It's a lacquer long molecule. This is vitamin B12, cobalamin. Cobalamin, why do we care about B12? It is a vitamin that cows can produce. They produce it in their rumen, and it's critical for the substrate binding of fibrolytic bacteria. Without vitamin B12, your fibrolytic bacteria cannot bind onto fiber particles. It's therefore critical for fiber digestion, necessary for most of our dairies because most of our dairies eat grass. And the rest of them that aren't on grass have an enormous portion of fiber in their diets. For fiber digestion, we need cobalt. Zinc and manganese. There is a ruminal requirement for zinc and manganese. There's also a cow requirement for zinc and manganese. But cobalt, there's a small requirement for the cow, but most of the cobalt we feed to cows must not be a rumen bypass form. It needs to be available in the rumen as available as possible. Moving on to selenium. There are two forms of selenium. There's sodium selenite in a selenite at the top. It's inorganic, it's cheap, it's common, it's been around since forever. And then there's selenomethionine, which is organic and sexy and fancy and expensive. All young people want the organic, sexy, fancy stuff. So lots of people want to go for selenomethionine because, you know, new science is the best kind of science, right? But when we feed selenium, we have to understand what we're trying to achieve. These things are not metabolized the same way. Sodium selenite is preferentially pushed towards selenocysteine and metabolized into glutathione peroxidase, which is the antioxidant that we want in the body. This is the antioxidant that saves us from a reactive oxygen species and all those things. This is actually what we want in the cows. Selenomethionine is only very slightly moved over to selenocysteine as antioxidants, but predominantly is stored in muscle and milk. Now, if you ever come across a dairy farmer that is being paid for high selenium milk, please let me know, because then I will refer the entire industry to that milk processor, because we don't get paid for selenium in our milk. And if we are looking for a storage form, then we need to think about when in the lactation of a cow we would want her to store selenium, which is a good antioxidant. So what happens, selenomethionine gets stored in the muscle. As the muscle is broken down, that selenium is released and then can do its job as an antioxidant. So if we're looking at the daily requirements of a cow, we can just feed sodium selenite to get the antioxidant capacity of that cow as high as possible. You can actually measure glutathione peroxidase. There is a lab test that measures glutathione peroxidase. Nobody uses it. Everybody just measures selenium. I don't know why, because we should just be measuring the thing we care about, which is glutathione peroxidase. We don't actually care about how much actual selenium is in a cow because we want the antioxidant. So storage, muscle and milk. If we come back to storage, when should we feed organic selenium to a cow? We should feed it to a cow in the dry period. When she has the third trimester, the fetus actually changes the mother's response to selenium in the diet and increases the amount of selenium that the mother takes up. Having a deposited form allows fetal selenium levels to be 2 to 4 times greater than the maternal. So when this calf comes out and meets the big bad world and gets her first sniffles and her first dose of E. coli at day 1 or 2, she will have the antioxidant capacity to deal with it. Selenium, also organic selenium, is deposited in milk, also colostrum. So we want that to be in the colostrum. So feeding a very expensive selenium source to our dry cows is the most logical time to do it. So, and not just the steamer, we want the full dry period, 60 days dry, we want organic selenium in those animals. Once they calve down, during the transition period and until peak, we can go sort of a 1/3, 2/3, or half-half, depending on the amount of body condition that we're losing in the animals. We can go some organic selenium in the early transition period, but for the rest of lactation, it's not necessary. We can provide the antioxidant stuff that we need directly to the animals. Chromium is the next big thing. It makes cows more insulin sensitive. Remember our glucose drip. By making them more insulin sensitive, we get more glucose into the cells out of the foodstuffs that we are feeding. It improves immune function, dry matter intake, body condition, lactation performance, fertility. Chromium's a really big deal. We only feed 8 milligrams of chromium, between 6 and 8 milligrams of chromium per cow per day. So it is an incredibly small amount. I mean, zinc is tiny and we feed 2,000 milligrams. So chromium is, it's a very interesting thing. And I'll show you just now that we're not even too sure where we should be with chromium in cows so far. It's very new. This is, I've left this slide the way it was because I used to explain that this is the engine of a car and this is the fuel tank of a car, until somebody much more mechanically minded than me pointed out that this is the gearbox of a car, not the engine. But I've left it the same. We've got an engine and we've got fuel, right? Where would you choose to measure the level of fuel in your vehicle? Would you measure it in the fuel tank, or would you measure it in the pipe right before it goes into the engine? Because where you measure the fuel has a great deal to do with what you think of your current situation. If you're measuring it right in the pipe, You will have 100% fuel. You will be perfect until you aren't, and then you will stand by the side of the road. If you're measuring it in the fuel tank, you can have a little gauge that tells you whether you're full, half, empty, 3/4, wherever. So measuring it in the fuel tank will give you a much better indication of where you're sitting on the spectrum than measuring it right before the engine. And this is what I'm talking about. If we look at measuring it in the blood, iodine, iron, and selenium are best measured in blood, and liver, zinc, copper, and manganese are stored in the liver for distribution when the immune system requires it. So measuring zinc in the blood is like measuring fuel right before the engine. Measuring selenium in the liver, we've already spoken about copper and the effects of selenium and copper. So we need to choose the right tissue to measure these minerals in, because one will have a normal distribution, just like the fuel tank, and the other has a homeostatic thing. So if we're measuring zinc in the blood, the animal's blood status can change and change and change and change as much as you want, and the blood level of zinc is not going to change. When it does change and it's very low, your animal is like the car that's going to stand by the side of the road. She's very, very deficient in zinc. And you could have seen that if you measured her in the liver. You can see her slowly sliding down the slope. You can do something about it and get it back. But if you're measuring blood, she's going to be down here before the blood actually shows you that she's deficient. So pick the right mineral. While we're picking the right mineral, please do it properly. We need to collect liver biopsies if we're doing biopsies. Zinc, manganese, copper are really important to measure. We need 20 cows. It's $1,700 a test, eh? So this is not cheap. But when you're dealing with a big herd of 1,500 cows and each one is worth 30 grand, it's a small price to pay twice a year to actually understand what's going on. 10% of the herd, I've never come across a large dairy farmer who samples 10% of their herd. It's just way too expensive. The target cows we want are the cows we wish we were farming. Do not pick these snoggle sickly things that are on death's door, because their immune system has used up all their minerals, and you're going to get a horrible indication of what's going on. We need our healthy cows. We need our top producing animals. If we are assessing the herd, we go 75 to 175 days in milk, around peak, just after peak. If we suspect problems, we can bring that forward to closer to the transition period. You don't want to analyze minerals directly after calving, and I'll show you why. We do need to record the cow number, the production, and the days in milk, because this is why it matters. Looking at liver copper, pre-calving, calving, breeding, weaning, pre-calving again. So this is a full fertility cycle, right? If we say that we want 100 ppm copper in the liver, this is what a beef cow does under normal circumstances. She deposits a whole bunch of calcium into the calf. She then produces milk and loses a bunch of calcium, copper, and therefore she drops to, what's that, about 80? And then once she kicks the calf off, she can rebuild back up to, call it 120. If we take one sample and we look at it and we happen to have sampled her there where my cursor is, we will have a very visceral reaction to, oh my goodness, we need copper, and we're going to provide our animals with more copper. We're then going to go next year. If we don't have a system, we'll go at some other random time next year, sample a bunch of cows, and we see, oh my goodness, we've got 120, we're like 30–40% more than we want. This is no good. We need to reduce the copper. So we make all of these drastic reactions to the levels that we're dealing with. But if we had just understood that this cow had just calved, or that this is a late lactation cow, if we know her days in milk and we know the cow number, then we can start actually interpreting the things that we do. And this is a large part of my job. It's what I do. This is a V&M Labs report of 8 liver biopsies. If we just look at our zincs here and our reference samples, zincs 125 to 250. So there's our reference level, right? Do you think the farmer is happy with these levels? Yes or no? I'll tell you what, it was no, because a lot of them are below 125. And he was like, I've got this team of clever oaks on my farm that's telling me that I don't need to add zinc. I want to add zinc. I'm feeding organics, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. I want to improve my zinc status in my animals. If we actually show him where I've got, these are just 100, we're up to about 260 liver biopsies now. 70% of these analyses fall between 75 and 125. If we come all the way up to 250, that's way up here. How many of our samples are actually falling between 125 and 250? It's less than 30% because there's some very low ones down here as well. So these zinc levels are actually okay for this herd. And what I do is I collect all of them, I produce this graph, and then I actually plot this farmer's information on the graph so that we can actually tell what's going on. And all of this is backed by peer-reviewed science so that we can help farmers understand exactly what's actually going on. If you don't have any symptoms of zinc deficiency, you do not need to be at 250. You don't need to be at 180. You can be in amongst this area here from 75 to 150 to 125. You can be in this area and still be farming perfectly well. Some farms are just high in zinc, others are not. It takes a degree of understanding. And a lot of what we need to understand are the jokers in the system. If Batman is the protagonist, then the Joker is the antagonist. And he doesn't sit around just wishing bad things to happen to Batman. He actively goes out and he starts messing with it. And this diagram is the one that nobody understands. So let me simplify it a little bit. There are two antagonists that we need to worry about. I must pick this up a little bit. First is the kite of doom and the triangle of fire. The kite of doom, iron, zinc, manganese, and copper. All of these antagonize each other. Copper, sulfur, and molybdenum form thiomolybdates, both in the rumen, in the intestine, in the blood, in the liver. They form thiomolybdates everywhere, and they reduce our copper intake. Here is a water sample from a client of mine showing 571% more iron than I expect to find in water, 632% more manganese, and 317% more molybdenum than we want. So when you look at this and the farmer tells you his biggest problem is fertility, I look at the manganese and I go, well, you've got plenty of manganese, and yeah, the iron's a bit high, so maybe that's an antagonist. But if we look at this and we actually understand it, the manganese in water is manganese oxide, which is unavailable for uptake. The iron in water is highly available. It's 3 times more available than the iron in feed. So this iron is antagonizing the manganese within the cells. This manganese is actually just blocking up the cells and not allowing the uptake of zinc, etc. And this very high molybdenum, the farmer had just started feeding some hay, and he was actually added some sulfur to his diet to aid with the digestion of hay. So the copper was actually being reduced. Now we put in a performance mineral of manganese and copper, and the farmers, actually went much better. Let me skip this one very quickly. This is all way too much for the end. So how do we manage our minerals? We need to actually understand, this is just a pasture example. June and July, we need to prepare for pregnancy for our summer calvers. We need to actually understand, we need to go on the farm, we need to talk to the vet, the farmer, the manager, and understand what we're doing. What is our plan for the coming season? Because the spring flush is going to come, then it's going to get really hot. And then in the middle of summer, we need to prepare our winter calvers for their calving. So we need to have these conversations on a regular basis. We need to set some goals for the coming season, because setting goals is like pulling a rubber band. You put pressure on the front by setting goals, you create a dissonance on the farm, and it pulls everybody else forward. Speaker yesterday mentioned SMART goals. Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound. You need to set goals that the farmer can actually measure. And this is the difference between normal minerals and performance minerals. You need to actually be able to have minerals that create an effect on farm that is measurable and achievable. So if we're talking about an 8% feed efficiency gain, we need to be able to achieve that 8% feed efficiency and measure it on farm. So those are the sorts of discussions that you need to have with your farmers when you're vets before each season, so that they can understand what they're doing with their minerals and bring some sanity to this mineral game. So in summary, if we consider that a high producing dairy cow is the equivalent of a Formula One race car, and they really are, which team would you choose to join as the vet? Would you choose to join the professionals, where each person has their place, where each person knows exactly what they're doing? Or would you be rustig op die plaas and figure this stuff out together over a couple of beers? The industry has moved on. There is no place for hillbilly nutritionists and vets any longer. We need to be professional. We need to work together. And I absolutely welcome anybody contacting me, getting hold of me. I would very much like to hear from you when you are qualified vets. We do a lot of mineral work with the feed companies and on farm. So yeah, please feel free to contact me. And that is the end of my story. Thanks, Kolja.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was really a good presentation. I don't think we've ever seen like a Batman at the dairy school. So definitely the best presentation so far. Anyone, if you have any questions, you can just raise your hand or you can just pop it in the chat box and then I can ask Alex. I see there is a question already from Corinne, so it's quite a long one. We recommend the injection of the AD3E and a multi-mineral injection for beef cattle in extensive production systems every 3 months to support production when the grazing is no longer green. Does a similar recommendation have grounds in a TMR dairy herd complementary to the feed formulations? And will it make a measurable dent in the micronutrient requirements, especially in cases where there are challenges with feed formulation and multiple issues to be addressed?
Okay, so there's the injectable question. Thank you. There's always the injectable question. Yes, so injectables do have a place in our market, but an injectable mineral like a multimin or a complex ANE or something like that that's providing trace minerals to the animal. You need to understand that there is a very small amount of mineral in those things, and they are designed to go with a complete mineral solution on the farm. We need to, a vet from Italy that was a mentor of mine several years ago, he said something that really stuck with me. He said, medicines must go in the vein and food must go in the mouth. And it's really worth remembering, we don't want to feed antibiotics. They need to go in a vein when they're needed. And we don't need to be injecting minerals, injecting nutrients when we can feed them. So AD and E, I think the multivitamin injection, I would absolutely recommend we keep doing that. It's really, really helpful, especially around calving, etc. With the multi-mineral injections, you're only getting a few hours worth of zinc and manganese. You're not getting nearly a day's worth of mineral out of it. I think you get 3 or 4 days worth of selenium out of a multi-mineral injection. But they are designed for an acute period of stress, like when you're working cattle or when a cow calves down. For that moment of stress, that's what they're designed for. And it says it on the package. It says to be used in conjunction with a complete mineral solution. So we do need to feed the minerals to the animals. Sulfates are very cheap, very accessible, very easy to feed, and they are available everywhere. Once you get into organics, they get more expensive. But again, even in extensive systems, performance minerals will have a major difference. on your outcomes. So yes, I would more strongly suggest that we keep the multi-mineral injections for critical periods, but find a way of actually feeding minerals throughout the whole time. And yes, it does apply to TMR, to grazing, beef, sheep, to all animals. I hope that answers your question, Corinne.
And then the next question is just how long can I keep my animal standing on the in the foot bath, and what is the best chemical to use? This person usually uses the copper sulfate.
Okay, so copper sulfate is a great one. Copper sulfate, zinc sulfate. I would keep using copper sulfate, and they don't need to stand in it for very long. The foot bath needs to be wide enough that each foot gets dunked twice every day. So a lot of the commercially available foot baths are a little short, and you'll see that your slightly bigger cows will actually step out of the foot bath on the second step. You don't need to stand them in it for a very long time. It really depends what you are trying to control with your foot bath as well. If you've got infectious problems, then daily foot bathing is a good thing because it reduces the load of the microbes on the feet, and also having clean feet is important, and that just goes with the frequency of foot bathing. We don't need to pre-dip them. We don't need to pre-dip them and try and wash the feet. That tends to just carry water into the foot bath and dilute out what's going on. So with our hygiene scores, if the feet are dirty, we just increase the frequency of foot bathing, but they don't need to stand in it for 5, 10, 15 minutes or anything like that. It can be quite a quick thing. In South America, I actually saw them trying to reduce the amount of copper in the groundwater because they were in a very high copper area, and they had a spray bottle on the table as the cows were being milked. They would actually go around and spray the backs of the feet to try and control hairy wart, and it was actually working. So a sort of a topical application of a foot spray was something that worked. I don't know anybody here that's doing it, but that might be an option for you.